Okay, so I'm going to try and do some exam practice for Lee with you. So I'm going to type out some model answers for the questions that you can see in front of you. So these are linking Lee to the key theme, to approaches and perspectives, and diversity. Now, I've purposefully on here not put the amount of marks because it does vary the amount of marks that these questions get asked for. I will explain some of that as we go along for particular questions, but I've mainly left that off so that you don't get hung up on the number of marks. If you write answers of this kind of quality with this amount of context, then you should still get marks for them. But like I say, I will point out any particular ones where if it is asked for a particular number of marks that you would need to make a particular kind of comment, I will make comment to that as we go through. So the first question, outline how Lee links with the key theme of moral development. So really, from our lesson, we've learned that it links with the key theme of moral development because it is showing that moral development still occurs and that there are age-related changes in moral thinking within cultures. So I'm going to use that to form part of my answer. Okay, so in answering this question, it is going to be just a simple P paragraph. So I've taken the information from that previous paragraph, from that previous slide, and I've just inputted it here. So the study shows that moral development occurs and that there are age-related changes in moral thinking within cultures. So because it's just a simple P paragraph and I've added in some evidence there, the next thing that I do just have to do is then I will need to add in some evidence to back up that point. So that would be some context from the study. So what we can talk about here is that in Lee's study, when we compared the Canadian children and the Chinese children against one another, that the ratings of truth-telling and lie-telling as good or bad started to show differences between the culture, particularly at certain ages. So what we will say is that in the pro-social study, so this is where a good deed was done. So in the pro-social study, lie-telling was rated differently based upon culture and age. And then I just need to give some evidence of that. So I've given some context there by talking about it being a pro-social study by mentioning the words lie-telling and obviously showing that I know it's about culture and about age. So I just need a finding to back it up. So I'm just going to back it up by stating that in both the Chinese and the Canadian cultures, lie-telling in pro-social situations was still deemed as a generally negative behaviour and then provide a figure to back that up. So we can see here that we are saying that both of these cultures, both Chinese and Canadian, are rating lie-telling as a negative behaviour at the values on average of minus 0.6 and minus 1.37. But interestingly, there are differences in culture. So I'm just going to show you the findings and point out those differences. So if we have a look here, we have got the average ratings of lie-telling and truth-telling. The cross-sectional ratings of age against culture. So we're just going to look at the ones that say combined for now, as we're not really interested on this one in whether it's social or physical. So here we've pulled out this figure and we've pulled out this figure. Okay, so they're both negative ones. However, we can see that the Canadian children, even at age 11, in the lie-telling good deed situation, still rate the lie being told as a negative behaviour, whereas age 11 in China, they're now rating it as a positive behaviour. So we just need to input that. We even see that difference at 9 years. They start to rate it as a positive behaviour. Okay, so it's up to you which of these two figures, which of these two pairs of figures you'd use, whether it was 9 years or 11 years, both would have the same impact, so you just input those. Okay, so then I finished off that evidence point by saying but Chinese children rated this more positively with age, as age 11 the Chinese children's average rating is 0.98, whereas the Canadian children's is -1. So I'm saying that they both begin to, at age 7, say that this is a negative behaviour, whereas with age, the Chinese children see this more positively than the Canadian children do. They still see it as a negative behaviour, less negative than they initially did, but still negative. And then I just need to explain that. So when I'm talking about explaining, all I'm really doing is explaining what this finding tells us about moral development. So I explain that this suggests that the children's moral reasoning changes with age, as both cultures saw the pro-social lie-telling as less negative with age. But as the Chinese children began to see this as a positive, culture may also impact this. Okay, and that's all you really have to do for that kind of question. This kind of question is usually going to get asked for around 3 or 4 marks. Okay, so next up we have this question. So that is, to what extent does Lee change our understanding of the key theme? Now again, I've not put the number of marks on for this because I've seen it asked for a range of marks, for probably usually anywhere up to perhaps about 5 marks. I think I've seen this asked. What I would say is, if it was asked for about 3 marks, if it was asked for about 5 marks, I would say that there is usually 3 of those marks would be allocated to your, to what extent does it change the understanding part, and then 2 of those marks will be allocated to your evidence, so evidence from both of the studies. Remember, this question is essentially saying, this is what the classic study told us. Does the contemporary study actually change that? Does it make it better in any way? So because this question is phrased, to what extent does it change our understanding, you can argue that it does. You can argue that it doesn't, as long as your reasoning is correct. So you can go either way. But also, because it says to what extent, if you are saying it does change our understanding, you need to indicate to what extent it does. So not just saying yes, it does change it, but saying that it changes it a lot, a little bit, somewhat, to what extent, as in how much does it change our understanding. So like I say, if it was asked for about 5 marks, there'd be 3 marks worth of your to what extent and how it changes it, and then a couple of marks available for context from each study. But again, I would make it kind of a simple like PE paragraph really. So I would say that there are a couple of things that you could talk about here. You only need to pick one. So looking at what we learned in lesson, you can say that it does change our understanding of key theme, Lee's research, because Kohlberg basically set out stages of moral reasoning, and there was some kind of cultural differences between those stages in terms of things like the rate at which you progress through them, but there weren't any distinct differences in moral reasoning. So this study does change the understanding that we've got from Kohlberg for 2 reasons. It changes it in the sense that it suggests that actually we don't have stages of moral reasoning. There aren't any universal stages that we all abide by. And also that there are significant cultural differences, not just in the way that you think about morality, but also in the rules, the moral rules. Okay, so you could pick either one of these points really. Okay, so I've just kind of taken that as my point. I've just picked one of the 2 because usually, like I say, you only need to take one and you're expected to be able to kind of expand and explore that point and elaborate upon it. So I've just taken the point that Lee's research changes our understanding to a large extent. So because I've written to a large extent, I've addressed this to what extent part of the question. Is often written into mark schemes that when questions are phrased to what extent, if you don't address that part, then you can't get full marks, or sometimes even into the top band. So I've addressed the to what extent part because I've said it does change it to a large extent, and then I've very briefly said why. Okay, so that's my point. So what I would move on to here is I would probably then give evidence. So we need some evidence from study 1 and evidence from study 2. So evidence from the classic, evidence from the contemporary, before I then go on to kind of explain and elaborate upon those differences. So here I have begun to use my my evidence from Kohlberg, because I'm suggesting here that he did actually look at cultural differences. So in his study, he suggested that some children came to the same moral decisions, but their reasoning was impacted by culture. So, for example, in stage 2, the Taiwanese boys, talking about the theft of food, said that it would be acceptable for the man to steal food to feed his wife, because if she was to die, he would have to pay for a funeral, and he probably couldn't afford to pay for a funeral. Whereas in Malaysian villages, the same decision was made, that it was okay for him to steal the food, but the reasoning was different. So the reasoning was that then if he didn't, the wife would die, and then the man would have nobody to cook for him. So he's not saying that your culture affects your moral judgments, but he's saying that it could affect your moral reasoning behind the judgments. Okay, so I've just changed up this sentence relating to Kohlberg a little bit. So I've basically just described how Kohlberg is saying that the stages are universal and they're not really affected that much by culture. So Kohlberg suggests that there is a set of universal, I'm even going to put this word in, invariant stages of moral development where culture has only a mild impact upon the moral reasoning, but made the same moral choices as each other. For example, in stage 2, Taiwan and Malaysia, where both suggest it is acceptable for a man to steal food, but for reasons embedded into their culture. However, Lee suggests that culture has a more drastic impact upon moral development as children from different cultures show different moral reasoning, as Canadian children disapprove of lie-telling in all conditions, whereas Chinese children began to rate lie-telling as a positive behaviour in pro-social situations more positively by age 9. Okay, so there I've probably picked up about 3 marks so far. I've picked up a mark for suggesting that there is a difference, and a mark each for suggesting that there's evidence as to why. So all I need to do really to finish this answer off now is explore how that changes our understanding. So I've just put that down as an explain, so you can see it's basically going to be just a slightly more complex version of a normal P paragraph. So what I'd expect to see here really is a couple of sentences in order to get those last couple of marks if this was asked for 5 marks. Obviously if it was asked for 4, what I've got here would probably be enough. So I'd add in a couple of sentences just explaining how that influences our understanding. So I've got here that this changes our understanding of how morals develop by suggesting that not only does your reasoning develop based upon your ingrained culture, but that your culture could affect the moral rules you abide by. And then I've just taken that a little bit further. As you age, the rule that it is moral to lie may change to incorporate cultural concepts, that the rule then becomes it's okay to lie in some circumstances. Okay, so if this question was asked for 5 marks, that would be enough to get you all 5. Okay, so moving on to the next question. The next one is outline how Lee can be considered in the developmental area of psychology. Again, I've not put the marks on for this. Usually this kind of question is asked for anywhere between 3 and 5 marks. What I would say is that if it's asked for around 3 marks, you are needing to link to a single assumption of the developmental area, whereas if it was asked for a bit more, so if I say 5 marks, it'd be wanting more depth to your answer and to link to another assumption. So the main approach or perspective that this does link to is the developmental approach, this study. There are also loose links to other approaches. So there are loose links to the cognitive approach if you consider that moral reasoning is a thought pattern, so it involves thinking and therefore it's cognitive, but also that this study does demonstrate the influence of culture and therefore you could talk about the social approach in there. But ultimately it's looking at the development of moral thinking over time. So it links to the developmental approach because the developmental approach assumes that behaviour is a result of systematic changes as we mature, and these changes can be influenced by things like our external environment or genetics, and Lee's study does focus on that external environment factor through looking at culture and cultural values, and also found that there are changes in maturation of thinking. So morals become stronger in children that are older. So if you look at the Chinese children at age 11 compared to age 7, they've then developed a more complex set of reasoning skills than they had at age 7. So I think that's probably the point of focus that I'm going to choose, is that the developmental area looks at how the development of behaviours is an ongoing process. And as the children are maturing, their development in terms of their morals is changing. So that's what I'm going to try and focus around for this answer. Okay, so I've made a bit of a point here. So I've kind of paraphrased an assumption of the developmental area. So in your point, you need to link to an assumption of whatever approach or perspective you're trying to link to in these questions. And I'd very also briefly say why. So Lee's study can be considered in the developmental approach as it links with the area's assumption that development of behaviours is an ongoing process, and so changes may be seen. And in order to link to the study, I'm going to say in moral reasoning throughout your lifetime. Obviously, this study focuses mainly around childhood rather than throughout your lifetime, but it is showing that as you mature, your moral reasoning is changing, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so next I have just included some evidence, so some findings from the study. I would always say that in these types of questions, your evidence needs to be your findings. So I've included some findings here that just influence the point that I've made. So the point that I've made being that we are seeing changes in your moral reasoning throughout your lifetime. I'm saying that in the pro-social story, moral reasoning around lie-telling changes relative to culture as maturation occurs, where children aged 7 rated this as a negative behaviour, but rated more positively at ages 9 and 11. And again, I've given the figures there. And while Canadian children still rated this negatively, it was rated less so. So I've given some findings there. And then all I need to do is just explain how that finding supports that link to the assumption. So I've literally just finished that off by suggesting that therefore these findings suggest that dependent upon your culture, your moral reasoning becomes more complex as you age, that you understand where moral rules, as you might call them, so by moral rules I mean the idea that lying is wrong, change in relation to their circumstance, that then lying becomes right under certain circumstances, basically. So it's just a nice, simple P paragraph. Assumption, evidence, explain how that evidence supports the assumption. Okay, again, and just a final question here. So that is this one: to what extent does Lee change our understanding of individual social or cultural diversity? Again, I've left the number of marks off because it has been asked for differing numbers of marks in the past. So I've seen this kind of question asked for around 3 marks. I've also seen it asked on some papers. A similar question also asked on the applied paper for around 5 marks. So what I would say is, in response to this question, say it was asked for 3 marks, you would have to just pick one of these types of diversity, so either individual, social or cultural, and you would just be giving 1p paragraph. Say that it was asked for 5. Obviously, again, it would want more depth and elaboration in your answer, but also I would consider either giving perhaps 2 ways that it does change our understanding of a type of diversity, or alternatively you could focus around 2 different types of diversity, but again it'd be looking for kind of 2 comments rather than 1 and a deeper level of elaboration and understanding. Okay. So with this, it seems to make sense to me that we pick cultural diversity. There's not really any social diversity, so the children selected were all from kind of similar cities, in the sense that they were all kind of provincial areas, and that they weren't from kind of heavy industrial backgrounds or anything like that. So we've got that. There isn't much in the way of individual diversity. The only thing that you could talk about there is you could potentially talk about age-related moral reasoning changes in individual diversity, I suppose. But the main thing that we can talk about here is cultural diversity, and there's a fair few points that you can make in relation to how this study shows that different cultures are diverse from one another. So in these types of questions, obviously diversity is demonstrating how we're different. So because the question is phrased to what extent, again, like I said for the previous one, that was also to what extent, that does mean that you can either say it does or it doesn't. So you could say it doesn't impact our understanding of this type of diversity, or it does impact our understanding of this type of diversity. But similarly, what I would say is that if you're saying it does, you need to say to what extent, so how much does it impact that? Again, this really just has to be a fairly simple P paragraph. Okay, so I'm going to make a point here about cultural diversity. Okay, so I know a lot of these answers that we've just done, sound fairly similar to each other because I'm using very similar evidence for each of them. But obviously they're all tailored to the question. And also just remember that you're not going to get asked like all of these questions in a row. So it's unlikely you'd get asked every single one of these questions. You're likely just going to get asked like one out of these four if you do get asked any. So yeah, don't worry about them being really similar and you're repeating yourself for now. But yeah, so I've made a point that Lee changes our understanding of cultural diversity. So I've clearly there picked my type of diversity. Don't make the examiner try and search for what type of diversity you're talking about, because obviously it's going to be harder for them to assign you marks if they have to actually search for what you're trying to say. So try and make it nice and clear. And by saying this is the type of diversity that I'm talking about, I'm saying it does change our understanding of it, and I've addressed the to what extent bit because I've said to a large extent. And I've also very briefly said why, because it demonstrates that the culture you are raised in can dramatically affect your moral reasoning. Okay, and then I just need to put in any piece of evidence which does illustrate that your culture can affect your moral reasoning. Okay, so just to mix it up for you, I've used kind of the same part of the study, but I've included a qualitative finding just to mix it up there. Again, quantitative or qualitative, I'm only using qualitative there because, we've used a quantitative one quite a few times, but you could use the same findings that we've used above already if you wanted to. So I'm just saying here that Chinese children, here's a cultural difference, Chinese children rated lying in pro-social situations significantly higher, or more positively, than Canadian children by age 9 and 11, stating you shouldn't leave your name when you do a good deed. So in other words, it's okay to lie and say, no, it wasn't me, I don't know who did that, when you've done something nice, because you shouldn't kind of beg for attention. So you could either just include that one, or if I just flick to these slides, you could include this one as well. It's begging or wanting praise when you have told the truth. So you could have included either of those really in this. And then all I need to do is just explain how this demonstrates cultural differences. Okay, so here I've just put specific social and cultural norms, such as the idea of an unsung hero. So that's why they were, potentially saying that you shouldn't leave your name, so that you're an unsung hero, you're a hero, but you're not asking for praise for it. Have an impact upon children's developing moral judgments, which are modified by age and experience within a culture, meaning that your moral reasoning may show diversity on this basis. Okay, and that's it. So again, just a nice simple P paragraph for you there. Okay, so that's all the questions that I'm going to go through. They're ones that students often find quite tricky, but if you want to scroll back through this video and copy these down into your notes, and then you have some kind of models to go off for similar types of questions. So each of these types of questions you would approach in the same way, using the same structure. You would obviously just modify the content based upon the study that you're talking about.